I've had the feeling of falling out of love with literature many different times in my life. And the common factor for each of those times has been this sense of obligation that I seemingly attach to the books that I want to read. As I accumulate more and more books, it becomes an accumulation of requirements, of this large, extended checklist of items that I eventually have to get to. And because I know the extent of the number of books ahead, it makes each individual book far less special in itself, and rather each book becomes an obstacle to get to the next one. That sense of appreciation of books begins to fade away along the margins. I'm thinking about this because since I started a booktube channel, it's actually affected a little bit how I'm reading. I'm starting to think as I read, well, how am I going to talk about this? Am I going to review this? What kind of analysis am I going to give? And it's been this nagging distraction on the edge of my mind. And I continuously have been finishing books and then sitting down to try to review them and then thinking, well, am I saying something clever? Am I being insightful enough? Am I illustrating something new? Am I just repeating what everyone else is saying? But that feeling of self-consciousness as I attempt to review is there as I attempt to read. This feeling of, am I reading carefully enough? Am I attending to the proper details? Am I smart enough to comprehend the layers at play within the text? Is the subtext merely eluding me somehow? And I'm just buffoonishly glancing over what is so deep within that iceberg of the prose that I'm just not quite skilled enough to excavate down to. And it's this feeling of self-consciousness as I read that feels very familiar to me. It's this self-consciousness that we start to feel about leisure generally. Reading is supposed to be personal. It is something for you. It is something that you're engaging with by yourself. Your own thoughts are the things reading back to you as you peruse through the text. And there's no one there to judge how you feel about those thoughts. There's no one there to know what it is that you read or what you think as you read. And I'm starting to think about this feeling of self-consciousness and what it does to reading itself. We seem to be burdened by too much leisure often. You can go online and there is an overabundance of videos to watch on YouTube. There is a plethora of films to check out. There's plenty of books to read. There are more than enough memes to laugh at. And knowing that there's an overabundance of availability of things to take up your time for fun, it makes the fun a kind of obligation that builds up, where suddenly it's, how can I consume this efficiently? I know that I have nowhere near as much time as I would like. I'm going to die someday. And then it's this matter of, well, in the allotted time that I get after work, which delimits a whole segment of time prior to sleep, within that segment of time, how can I be efficient within that time? And to me, that feeling of your leisure as a kind of resource that is scarce, that you have to mine from yourself, it creates a kind of self-exploitation where you are now the worker trying to most efficiently gleam out the aspects that matter so that you can pull something out and use it in some later aspect of your life. It becomes like your own self-help guru for yourself, just trying to pick out the nuggets that matter and ignore all the other bits. And to me, it removes so much of that initial pleasure that leisure, at least for me, otherwise offers, which is the pleasure of laying back and letting go, of not just working your way through things, of not having a big list of items to get to and checking them off one after the other. Instead, for me, the purpose of leisure is not merely relaxation, but shutting off that egoistic voice in your head that defines you so rigidly and discovering something, allowing yourself to wander a while, and it's a bit like you're taking a hike somewhere And instead of merely following the trail, you pause and look out and start to wonder about alternative trails that could have been and the ones that you can define for yourself. When I sit to read a book, I sometimes have to remind myself how relieving that headspace can be. The headspace of letting that voice in the book be distinct from yours, not something self-defined ahead of time, not something where it's all merely what you already know, rather the idea that there's so much more that you don't know, and if you let go, you can actually discover it and be surprised by what it is that you read. I recently just finished reading the collected novellas of Arno Schmidt, and in the process of reading this book, it's such a strange book. Arnold Schmidt writes in his own, as the Grim Reader puts it, he kind of develops his own little language. You can either butt heads with that language, with that form of syntax that he employs, or you can adapt to it and allow yourself to sink in and discover what it is that he was aiming for in his unusual use of punctuation and extending lines into the margins. He has this film cut style where each paragraph, instead of continuously flowing from the prior one, each paragraph rather feels like a time cut, like a sudden jump in time or a sudden jump in thought. And he uses colons in such a way that he's constantly promising completion of an idea, and you have to reverse back to the opening line to understand and grasp what it is that's actually being communicated. So there's an initial feeling of loss or confusion at the start of many lines, and the expectation is that you have to slow down and consider what is the missing puzzle piece that is being filled in by the later portion of the sentence. For example, the monument, a man draped in the customary timeless bed sheets pointed imperiously before his feet, a cowering slave, armed with a match, took up his position before a pile of marble books. No inscription, a man who'll never be honored enough, Omar, who long ago put the torch to the Library of Alexandria. Aha, I said uncomprehendingly. As you can see in the short passage that I just read through, Arnold Schmidt employs punctuation in an unusual way. He's constantly anticipating and building, promising, and then completing his ideas, and then you have to piece it together yourself mentally and make sense of that unusual order of description that he allows. He doesn't give things in chronological order of impression, but rather in the scattered attention of you walking into a room and picking up the details that matter to you first, and then piecing together the later post hoc facts that suddenly matter in a new way. And then all of those come together in a kind of gestalt. And it's this feeling of continuous gestalts being delivered over time that you have to orchestrate in your own way, layering the instrumentation that he is otherwise delivering in his descriptions. You could miss the harmony of it if you're not attentive to the ways in which all those different pieces come together. And I felt myself missing the harmony so much, not fully embracing the music of it, but rather rushing and rushing and rushing and rushing. And it made me think that I was missing out on what was happening in the text because I was so focused on this obligation or this end goal of finishing the book and then moving on and having something to say about it. I went back and I decided to reread from the very beginning and slow down again and just let myself read as slowly as I possibly can and just enjoy it again and just embrace the reading of it. And it got me thinking to just make this video now to you to remind you that books used to be such precious things. It used to be the case that when you first read a book, it felt like an extraordinary accomplishment. Like the first time you wrote a whole page of text and turned it in for an essay assignment. Remember how that felt to have a whole page be something so grand? It felt like, oh, I'm a writer now that I've written this. It used to be the case that when you read a book, it felt like a big deal to read a book. And over the long span of our lifetime, all of those details accumulate in such a way that every individual example now suddenly becomes very small in comparison to the tapestry of individual images of books that accumulate within memory over time. And I'm trying to remind myself to just appreciate that singular detail again, to not let the whole drown out the value of each individual work of literature, to remember why it is that I love books in the first place. And so I want to remind you to read without purpose sometimes, not all of the time. There's plenty of value in focus. But focus can also narrow your view. It can become a myopic way of taking something in, such that you can miss all of the intangibles along the margins, the things that don't quite slot into what you already know. And so much of good literature is actively trying to get you to notice things that you had not noticed before. Perhaps make you, in the case of poetry, make you re-see something that you had seen thousands of times before and make you see it as if it's brand new again. There's aspects of it that you did not notice. It makes me think of the use of metaphor in writing, the ways that you can create an analogy for something, and the purpose of the analogy is to make you notice a different kind of detail within that thing. For instance, if there is a blanket of snow on the ground and I describe it very briefly as a blanket, you see the snow as one solid mass. All the curvature of that mass of snow is now one soft blanket for you to fall into. For a fraction of a second, you have this feeling of comfort attached to the snow rather than the reality of what's in that snow, all the things that don't fit the metaphor, such as the fact that the snow is not one solid mass, it is rather a cascade of particulates accumulated along the ground. The fact that if you were to jump into that snow, it would not be quite so comforting, it would rather be harsh and sharp and cold. The fact that the snow itself is not purely a white blanket, it doesn't have the solidity of color of a single object, but rather it would be something mixed, a whole spectrum along the hues of what white to dark can be. And it is those differences that get drowned out for a moment when you have that metaphor of a blanket of snow on the ground. And it makes me think about how much our attention has to be limited to a certain extent. We can't take in everything all at once. And sometimes when we're reading a book and we're trying so hard to focus on some kind of deliverable out of that book, that here's the thing that I'm going to grab out of it, I'm going to chew on it, I'm going to be able to regurgitate it back out. At that point, you're only thinking in terms of digestion of the nutritious elements, the elements that matter to you somehow. But what matters to you is always based on what you've already known, not what you don't yet know. And I think sometimes it's vital to just take in something without processing completely, without needing to force the meaning out of it, and rather just allow the gliding through the text, the wondering amidst the text. Sometimes something that I like to do is to just grab a book off the shelf and just embrace a single line and just feel that for a time. Not be in a rush to go book after book after book to accumulate a kind of series of trophies of things that you've read. For instance, I grabbed Terra Nostra by Carlos Fuentes off of the wall, and I just read the opening line. In this case, it says, "Incredible, the first animal that dreamed of another animal. Monstrous, the first vertebrate that succeeded in standing on 2 feet and thus spread terror among the beasts still normally and happily crawling close to the ground through the slime of creation. Astounding, the first telephone call, the first boiling water, the first song, the first loincloth," and then stop and actually feel astounded for a time. Let yourself think about everything used to be, as Robert Frost put it, as good as gold before it had accumulated and then lost its preciousness. And what if you treated books as precious again and just stop trying to rush through them, stop trying to accumulate more and more so that you can seem smart to someone outside of yourself. The only life that matters is your life, not everyone else's opinion of it. And you can just read something and enjoy it for its own sake, again and again, its own sake, reread, just rediscover why you care about literature. And for me, the purpose of this video, the thing that I end up caring so much about is letting go, letting the literature dictate to me what it is that I should feel in that moment, letting myself meet another mind far, far away, either at a great distance of time or literal distance of space, and feel my way back into that difference, that fundamental difference between myself and someone else, that interpersonal distinctness and that yawning chasm between who I am and some kind of deeper thoughts of another. And that feeling is special to me, and I want to remind you to get back into that, to read without purpose and just let go sometimes. Let go, at least for a little while, and not try to just read and read and read. Some people have asked me, well, how many books have you read? Or do you have a big list of all the books that you read? I don't make lists of anything, because then I'm taking this leisure activity. I'm taking this thing that is purely personal and for my own pleasure and enlightenment, and I'm turning it into something tangible and stiff and stilted and brought down to ground. And I don't want it brought down to ground. I want it high, high up in the air, and breathe in the air, that kind of cold, foggy air of someone else's questions and musings and the ways that authors don't often have answers. And it's nice to just let those answers drift for a while away from us and just bask in the questioning that literature offers. And it's in basking in the questioning, that open-endedness of not needing certainty, that is, to me, reading without purpose. Avoid certainty, avoid goals, just let yourself enjoy it again. And ironically, it leads, at least in my case, to reading more books than I otherwise would, because I'm enjoying them the whole way through. And maybe if you're not enjoying the process of reading books, it's because you have so many other accumulated future memories of books that you anticipate reading, and you're not allowing yourself to just sit with the one that's in hand right in front of you. And maybe that's what we're missing sometimes, is we're so focused on all of the things that could be, all the things that we could enjoy, and we're not actually enjoying what we have right there in front of us. So that's what I want to remind you of. Read books without purpose. Do anything without purpose from time to time. Just let yourself